In the heart of a vast and fading wilderness, something extraordinary began to unfold. A forest stretching nearly 1,000 kilometers, once dense with life, layered with sound, and rich in biodiversity, had fallen into an eerie silence. The rivers still flowed, the wind still moved through the trees, but something essential was missing. An invisible thread had been severed. Then, without precedent, thousands of wolves were released into this fragile ecosystem. What followed would challenge long-held assumptions about nature, ecological balance, and the delicate interplay between predator and prey. At first, the decision seemed almost reckless. Why introduce apex predators into an already unstable environment? Could the ecosystem even withstand such a dramatic intervention? And more importantly, what would happen next? For decades, this forest had been slowly unraveling. Once home to a complex web of species, it had suffered from a quiet but devastating collapse. The removal of large predators, driven by human expansion and hunting policies of the past century, had triggered a chain reaction few had fully anticipated. Without wolves, herbivore populations, particularly deer and elk, began to grow unchecked. At first, this seemed harmless. More herbivores meant more visible wildlife, a sign, some believed, of a thriving environment. But the reality beneath the surface told a different story. As their numbers increased, these animals began to overgraze. Young saplings were devoured before they could mature. Shrubs and undergrowth disappeared. Riverbanks, once stabilized by dense vegetation, began to erode. Over time, entire sections of the forest lost their ability to regenerate. Scientists observed a steady decline in plant diversity. Bird populations began to drop as nesting grounds vanished. Small mammals lost shelter. Insects, dependent on specific plants, disappeared in large numbers. Even the soil itself began to degrade, losing nutrients essential for long-term ecological health. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, systemic unraveling. An ecosystem out of balance. Research teams studying the region documented alarming statistics. In some areas, vegetation cover had declined by over 60%. Certain native plant species had nearly vanished. River systems showed increased sediment levels, indicating widespread erosion. The absence of a single species, the wolf, had reshaped the entire landscape. This phenomenon, known in ecological science as a trophic cascade, reveals how apex predators influence multiple layers of an ecosystem. Their presence regulates prey populations, which in turn affects vegetation, soil stability, water systems, and ultimately, biodiversity as a whole. Without wolves, the cascade had reversed. Nature had tipped out of equilibrium. It was within this context that a controversial idea emerged. A coalition of ecologists, wildlife biologists, and environmental organizations proposed a radical solution: reintroduce wolves on an unprecedented scale. Not a few dozen. Not even a few hundred. But thousands. The plan was ambitious, bordering on experimental. It would require careful coordination, long-term monitoring, and acceptance of significant risk. The wolves would be sourced from multiple regions, genetically diverse, and gradually introduced into carefully selected zones across the forest. The objective was clear: restore ecological balance. But the path forward was anything but certain. Local communities expressed concern. Farmers feared livestock losses. Some policymakers questioned the ethics of such a large-scale intervention. Critics argued that ecosystems, once altered, could not simply be reset. Others worried about unintended consequences. What if the wolves failed to adapt? What if they disrupted existing species even further? What if the solution created new problems more severe than the original? Despite the controversy, the project moved forward. Over the course of several months, transport teams relocated wolves from distant regions. Each animal was tracked, studied, and carefully released into designated areas. Satellite collars allowed scientists to monitor their movements in real time. At first, the forest remained unchanged. The wolves, disoriented in their new environment, spread out cautiously. They established territories, formed packs, and began the slow process of adapting to unfamiliar terrain. Weeks passed. Then months. From a distance, it seemed as though nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, subtle shifts were already underway. The wolves began to hunt. Their primary targets, overabundant deer and elk, were suddenly no longer free to roam without consequence. Grazing patterns changed almost immediately. Herds that once lingered in open valleys began to move more frequently, avoiding areas where wolves had been detected. This behavioral change, known as the ecology of fear, had profound implications. Animals were no longer simply consuming resources, they were responding to risk. As a result, certain areas of the forest experienced a temporary reprieve from grazing pressure. Young plants, previously eaten before maturity, began to grow. At first, the change was almost invisible. A few saplings reaching higher than before. Patches of shrubs appearing along riverbanks. Isolated signs of recovery. Scientists monitoring the region documented these early indicators with cautious optimism. Data collected from vegetation plots showed slight increases in plant density. Soil samples revealed improved moisture retention in areas less disturbed by herbivores. Yet the transformation remained fragile. It was too early to draw conclusions. The wolves themselves faced challenges. Some packs struggled to establish stable territories. Others encountered competition or difficulty finding sufficient prey in certain zones. Mortality rates during the first year were higher than expected. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. Pack structures stabilized. Hunting efficiency improved. Population dynamics shifted. By the end of the second year, researchers began to notice something more significant. Herbivore populations were not just changing behavior, they were declining in number. This reduction was not catastrophic, but it was measurable. A decrease of approximately 15 to 20% in key areas suggested that predation was beginning to regulate population growth. This, in turn, reduced pressure on vegetation. The forest, long suppressed by overgrazing, was beginning to respond. In regions where wolves were most active, young trees showed increased survival rates. Willow and aspen, once nearly absent in certain valleys, began to reappear. Grasslands exhibited greater diversity, supporting a wider range of insect life. And with these changes came something unexpected. The return of other species. Birds, absent for years, began nesting in recovering vegetation. Small mammals found new shelter among growing shrubs. Even predators such as foxes and birds of prey appeared to increase in number, benefiting indirectly from the changing environment. Yet, despite these early signs, the full impact of the intervention remained uncertain. Ecosystems are complex. They do not respond instantly. And the true measure of success would require time, years, perhaps decades. By the third year, however, something deeper began to unfold. Not just changes in individual species, but shifts in the structure of the ecosystem itself. Riverbanks, once eroded and unstable, showed signs of stabilization. Vegetation along waterways began to take root, reducing sediment runoff. Water clarity improved in certain regions, indicating a healthier hydrological system. These changes suggested that the impact of the wolves extended far beyond their immediate role as predators. They were reshaping the environment. Quietly. Gradually. But undeniably. Still, questions remained. Could this transformation continue? Would the ecosystem fully recover, or reach a new, unfamiliar state? And what unforeseen consequences might still lie ahead? As the fourth year approached, scientists intensified their monitoring efforts. Because what they were beginning to observe hinted at something far more profound than simple restoration. It suggested a cascading transformation, one that would redefine the very identity of the forest. By the fourth year, the transformation was no longer subtle. What had once been a quiet experiment had evolved into a measurable ecological shift, one that extended far beyond the wolves themselves. Scientists monitoring the region began documenting a series of cascading effects, each interconnected, each amplifying the next. This was no longer just predator reintroduction. It was the reactivation of an entire ecosystem. The most immediate and visible change emerged along the forest floor. In areas previously stripped bare by overgrazing, vegetation had returned with unexpected speed. Satellite imagery revealed a steady increase in plant cover, up to 35% in certain zones. Native grasses, wildflowers, and shrubs began to reclaim space once dominated by exposed soil. This resurgence supported a dramatic rise in insect populations. Pollinators such as bees and butterflies reappeared in significant numbers, drawn by the return of flowering plants. Entomologists recorded a near doubling of insect biodiversity within just 3 years in some monitored plots. This, in turn, influenced higher trophic levels. Bird species that had long abandoned the forest began to return. Songbirds nested among the newly formed undergrowth. Raptors, including hawks and owls, found increased prey availability. Acoustic monitoring devices detected a 60% rise in bird calls compared to pre-intervention baselines. The forest was regaining its voice. Yet one of the most profound changes occurred not in the canopy or the soil, but along the rivers. Before the wolves returned, the riverbanks had suffered severe degradation. With herbivores grazing freely along waterways, vegetation had been unable to stabilize the soil. As a result, erosion increased, sediments clouded the water, and aquatic habitats deteriorated. Now, that trend was reversing. With herbivores altering their grazing behavior and avoiding exposed river edges, plant life began to recover along the banks. Willows and reeds took root, forming natural barriers that reduced erosion. Over time, water clarity improved, and sediment levels dropped by nearly 25% in some sections. These changes had ripple effects beneath the surface. Fish populations, previously in decline, began to stabilize. Cooler, clearer water created more suitable conditions for spawning. Aquatic insects returned, providing a critical food source for fish and amphibians. Even beavers, long absent from large portions of the forest, began to reappear. Their return marked a pivotal moment. As natural ecosystem engineers, beavers constructed dams that slowed water flow, creating wetlands and expanding aquatic habitats. These wetlands acted as reservoirs, improving water retention during dry periods and supporting a wide range of species. What began with wolves had now transformed entire hydrological systems. Scientists refer to this as a secondary cascade, a chain reaction triggered not directly by the predators, but by the environmental changes they initiated. The data supporting these observations was extensive. Over 5 years, long-term ecological monitoring recorded measurable improvements across multiple indicators. Vegetation density increased by an average of 28% across surveyed areas. Herbivore populations stabilized at sustainable levels. Soil quality improved, with higher organic content and reduced compaction. Biodiversity indices, used to measure the variety of species within an ecosystem, showed consistent upward trends. In simple terms, life had returned. But perhaps the most surprising outcome was not just the recovery itself, it was the speed. Conventional ecological theory often suggests that degraded ecosystems may take decades, even centuries, to recover. Yet in this case, significant changes occurred within just 5 years. This raised new questions. Had the ecosystem been more resilient than previously believed? Or had the presence of wolves accelerated processes that would otherwise take far longer? Research suggests the answer lies in both. The forest, though damaged, had not lost its foundational structure. Seeds remained in the soil. Certain species persisted in isolated pockets. Given the right conditions, recovery was possible. What the wolves provided was not just predation, but regulation. They reintroduced balance. By controlling herbivore populations and influencing their behavior, they allowed other components of the ecosystem to function as intended. This restored the natural feedback loops essential for long-term stability. Yet the transformation was not without complexity. Not all changes were uniformly positive. In certain areas, reduced herbivore populations affected species that depended on open grazing lands. Some plant communities shifted in composition, favoring species better adapted to reduced grazing pressure. Predation also introduced new dynamics, with smaller predators adjusting their behavior in response to wolf presence. Ecosystems, after all, are not static. They evolve. And restoration does not mean returning to a fixed point in the past, but moving toward a new equilibrium. Local communities, once skeptical, began to reassess their views. While concerns over livestock predation remained, mitigation strategies, such as improved fencing and monitoring, helped reduce conflict. In some regions, ecotourism increased as the restored ecosystem attracted researchers, photographers, and wildlife enthusiasts. The presence of wolves, once seen as a threat, became a symbol of renewal. Governments and environmental organizations took notice. The project, initially viewed as risky, began to influence conservation strategies worldwide. Similar